What if everything you've been told about the Ukraine war is only part of the story? While headlines focus on drones and sanctions, the battlefield reality may be telling a very different tale. Today, we'll uncover the facts that many media outlets aren't discussing, and the consequences could reshape how you see this conflict forever. If you value sharp analysis and the stories others won't tell, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. You won't want to miss what's coming next. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a society when the story it has embraced begins to collide with reality. It is not the silence of stability or consensus. Rather, it is the silence that emerges when editors decide which facts deserve attention, when broadcasters weigh what audiences are prepared to hear, and when institutions attempt to manage public perception. At present, that silence is especially noticeable in discussions surrounding the war in Ukraine. Let me be clear from the outset. Developments on the ground in eastern Ukraine, the realities unfolding in frontline towns, defensive positions, and active combat zones are receiving remarkably limited attention across much of the Western media landscape. There are occasional reports from major outlets, carefully framed and cautiously worded, but sustained coverage of battlefield developments remains surprisingly scarce. Yet while attention is directed elsewhere, the military situation continues to evolve. Key defensive positions are being abandoned. Strategic locations are changing hands. The map itself is being redrawn. And despite the significance of these developments, many of the institutions responsible for informing the public have shown little enthusiasm for examining them in detail. That is the central issue worth exploring today. Not simply the military developments themselves, although those deserve careful examination, but also the increasingly distorted information environment surrounding the conflict. More importantly, we must ask what that distortion reveals about the broader challenges facing Western strategic communication. There is also another question that deserves attention. How is it possible that Russia, which by several military measures appears to hold the strategic initiative, continues to struggle so significantly in the battle for public perception and international narrative? That contradiction offers valuable insight into the way power operates in the modern era. To understand it, we must begin with the situation on the ground. The city of Konstantinovka, which had a pre-war population of approximately 80,000 residents, now appears to be effectively under Russian control. The remaining combat activity resembles less a contested battle for possession and more the final stages of securing territory already largely won. Russian forces are conducting clearance operations throughout residential districts. To appreciate the scale of that task, it is important to understand the nature of Soviet-era urban construction. These are not small apartment blocks. They are vast residential complexes housing large numbers of families across multiple floors and interconnected structures. Clearing such buildings is a slow and methodical process. Soldiers must search for remaining defenders, inspect concealed positions, and identify explosive devices that may have been left behind during withdrawal. Stairwells, basements, utility corridors, and abandoned apartments all require careful examination. Such operations take time. They require patience, discipline, and caution. Whether the process lasts several days or several weeks, however, the broader outcome appears increasingly difficult to dispute. A similar pattern can be observed in Lyman. Reports indicate that Ukrainian forces are no longer focused primarily on holding existing positions, but are instead withdrawing from them. That distinction is significant because it reflects a shift from defense to repositioning. Equally noteworthy is the level of detail emerging from Russian reporting on the fighting. Historically, detailed battlefield coverage in Russian state media tends to appear when authorities are confident that developments support a narrative of military success. It is generally not the style of reporting associated with setbacks or defensive explanations. If we step back from these individual locations and consider the wider operational picture, the significance becomes even clearer. Russian forces are reportedly operating within close range of Kramatorsk. Militarily speaking, proximity alone is important, but control of elevated positions overlooking key areas carries even greater significance. Reports also indicate that civilian administrative functions have been relocated and that elements of the Ukrainian military command structure previously operating in the area have been withdrawn. Military headquarters do not typically relocate during periods of confidence and stability. Such moves are often undertaken when commanders anticipate increased operational risk, potential encirclement, or a deteriorating security environment. Kramatorsk, together with Sloviansk, occupies a position of enormous strategic importance. These cities represent two of the most significant remaining urban centers within the broader Donbas theater. Their future carries implications that extend well beyond local military considerations. Should they eventually fall under Russian control, Moscow would be significantly closer to achieving one of the principal territorial objectives it identified at the beginning of the expanded conflict. And the developments are not limited to Donbas alone. Further northeast, Russian forces have reportedly moved closer to Sumy, a major regional center with a population measured in the hundreds of thousands. Reports suggest that defensive positions north of the city have come under substantial pressure, creating serious concerns for Ukrainian military planners. By any conventional military assessment, these are developments of considerable significance. One might reasonably expect such events to dominate strategic analysis, headline coverage, and public debate. Yet much of the conversation has shifted elsewhere. Rather than focusing primarily on battlefield developments, much of the current narrative has become centered around two themes: drone warfare and economic pressure. The first of these themes emphasizes Ukraine's ability to strike targets deep inside Russian territory. According to this narrative, Ukrainian forces have demonstrated ingenuity and resilience by targeting infrastructure, military facilities, and locations far beyond the front line. High-profile incidents involving drone strikes near Moscow have generated widespread international attention and have been presented as evidence of Ukraine's continued offensive capability. There is truth within that argument. The strikes are real. The drones have traveled considerable distances. Some have successfully reached areas that were once considered largely insulated from direct attack. However, a more complete assessment requires additional context. Long-range drones inevitably face technical limitations. Their lightweight construction restricts the size of the explosive payloads they can carry. Many are intercepted before reaching their intended targets, while others cause damage that, although visually dramatic, is often less strategically significant than headlines initially suggest. One widely reported strike near Moscow generated striking images and considerable media attention. Some reports suggested severe disruption lasting many months. Yet assessments from individuals familiar with the energy sector indicate that the actual repair timeline may be significantly shorter, potentially measured in days or weeks rather than half a year. That distinction matters because understanding the difference between symbolic impact and strategic impact is essential when evaluating the true significance of any military action. That is not to suggest that Ukraine's drone campaign is without value. Far from it. The strikes serve several important purposes. They boost domestic morale, demonstrate continued operational capability to Western supporters, and force Russia to allocate additional resources to air defense and homeland security. Those effects are genuine and should not be dismissed. However, they are not necessarily the hallmarks of a force dictating the course of a conventional war. Rather, they reflect a strategy designed to offset battlefield difficulties by creating alternative forms of pressure and maintaining a narrative of resilience. The renewed focus on Crimea follows a similar pattern. Compared with drones launched toward Moscow, operations targeting Crimea benefit from shorter flight distances, larger potential payloads, and reduced warning times. As a result, they have a greater chance of reaching their targets and inflicting meaningful damage. Yet the strategic thinking behind these operations is hardly new. It rests on the long-standing assumption that Crimea represents Russia's critical vulnerability, that sufficient pressure on the peninsula could fundamentally alter the direction of the wider conflict. We have heard that argument before. We have seen it repeatedly throughout the course of the war. And despite previous disappointments, it continues to reappear whenever discussion shifts away from developments unfolding on the Eastern Front. Alongside drone warfare, the second major pillar of the prevailing narrative concerns Russia's economy. For more than 2 years, audiences across Europe and North America have been told that Western sanctions would gradually erode Russia's economic foundations. The expectation was that mounting financial pressure would weaken Moscow's ability to sustain military operations and eventually force strategic concessions. This argument continues to feature prominently in major publications and policy discussions. The message remains broadly consistent. Russia's economy may not be collapsing today, but decline is inevitable and only a matter of time. The difficulty is that reality has proven more complicated. Russia's economy has certainly faced significant challenges. Sanctions have imposed costs, disrupted supply chains, and created obstacles across multiple sectors. Yet the broader collapse that many predicted has not materialized. Instead, Russia has adjusted. Trade routes have been redirected. New commercial partnerships have emerged. Alternative financial mechanisms have been established. The economy has adapted in ways that many observers initially underestimated. Recognizing this does not require dismissing the impact of sanctions altogether. Clearly, they have had consequences. The point is simply that repeated predictions of imminent economic breakdown have failed to align with observable outcomes. When forecasts are made repeatedly and do not come to pass, questions inevitably arise regarding the credibility of those making them. This brings us to what may be the most intriguing aspect of the entire discussion. On the surface, the situation appears straightforward. Russia is advancing militarily in several sectors. Its economy has demonstrated greater resilience than many expected. And the broader trajectory of the conflict appears more favorable to Moscow than many Western analysts anticipated at the outset. Yet despite those advantages, Russia continues to struggle in one crucial arena, the battle for international perception. In many respects, it is losing the information war. That raises an important question. How can a country enjoying relative success on the battlefield fail so consistently in shaping the narrative surrounding that success? The answer becomes clearer when examining specific examples. Consider the reaction to drone strikes on Moscow. Images of smoke rising over the Russian capital were rapidly circulated across global media platforms. They generated dramatic headlines and reinforced perceptions of vulnerability within Russia itself. The visual impact was undeniable, but what followed from the Russian government was striking in its absence. There was no immediate and comprehensive public briefing. No detailed presentation explaining the extent of the damage. No coordinated effort to provide journalists with access to affected locations. No senior officials standing before cameras to demonstrate that repairs were already underway or that the strategic consequences were limited. Instead, the response was largely characterized by brief official statements offering little in the way of detailed explanation. The result was predictable. In the absence of a strong alternative narrative, the dominant interpretation quickly became the accepted one. That failure speaks to something deeper than communication strategy alone. It reflects a broader political culture. At its core, Vladimir Putin appears to place limited importance on information warfare as a strategic discipline. His comments in high-profile interviews have occasionally reflected this attitude. There is a recurring suggestion that narrative competition is ultimately secondary to military realities and hard power. From that perspective, battlefield achievements matter more than media narratives. The problem, however, is that modern conflicts are not decided solely by military developments. Public perception influences political support, economic policy, alliance cohesion, and long-term strategic commitment. In today's world, information is not merely an accompaniment to conflict. It is one of its central battlegrounds. History offers useful comparisons. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union maintained extensive systems dedicated to public communication. Daily updates were issued. Military developments were explained. Information was carefully managed, but it was also actively distributed. The objective was clear: shape understanding, maintain morale, and influence both domestic and international audiences. Modern Russia, by contrast, often appears hesitant to engage in that contest with the same level of determination. The comparison becomes even more striking when viewed alongside countries with far fewer resources. Iran, for example, has repeatedly demonstrated an ability to communicate strategic intentions clearly and consistently, despite operating under significant international pressure. Its messaging tends to be direct. Its red lines are clearly defined. Its responses are designed not merely to convey information, but to shape expectations. Russia's communication strategy frequently appears less focused and more ambiguous. That ambiguity becomes particularly evident when discussing sensitive issues involving NATO and the broader Western alliance. Statements touching on matters of major strategic significance are often delivered without sufficient clarity or follow-through. Messages become diluted, explanations remain incomplete, and before long, competing interpretations begin to dominate public discussion. The consequence is a recurring pattern. Warnings are issued but not fully reinforced. Red lines are announced but appear flexible. Threats are articulated but subsequently softened or qualified. Over time, this affects credibility. Governments across Europe assess not only what is said, but whether statements are ultimately backed by action. When they conclude that warnings are unlikely to carry meaningful consequences, they become more willing to accept risks that they might otherwise avoid. In strategic terms, that can have profound implications, because deterrence depends not merely on capability, but on the perception that capability will be used when necessary. And when that perception weakens, escalation often becomes easier rather than harder. What explains this persistent weakness in Russia's information strategy? The answer is not straightforward, but it can be understood through several interconnected factors. Together, they reveal a great deal about how Vladimir Putin views power, how the Russian state operates, and why Moscow continues to struggle in a domain that has become increasingly important in modern conflict. The first factor is cultural and generational. Putin is, in many respects, a product of the late Soviet political system. He emerged from an environment in which information was primarily regarded as an instrument of domestic control rather than a tool of international persuasion. The Soviet model was largely defensive in nature. Authorities focused on managing internal narratives, limiting access to unwanted information, and dismissing foreign criticism as hostile propaganda. Success was measured by control, not by the ability to compete effectively for global public opinion. That mindset appears to have endured. Putin has consistently demonstrated a belief that hard power remains the ultimate measure of influence. Military capability, economic resilience, diplomatic leverage, and state authority are viewed as the decisive factors. Public narratives, media campaigns, and perception management are often treated as secondary concerns. From that perspective, events on the battlefield matter far more than discussions taking place in television studios or on social media platforms. The challenge is that modern geopolitics does not operate according to that distinction. Today, perception shapes policy. Public understanding influences elections, foreign aid decisions, military assistance packages, sanctions regimes, and alliance cohesion. Information has become a strategic resource in its own right. The second factor is structural. Over the years, Russia has built a media system that functions effectively within its own borders. It can promote preferred narratives, suppress inconvenient stories, and maintain a relatively stable domestic information environment. What it has not developed is a highly effective mechanism for competing internationally. Those are fundamentally different tasks. Managing domestic opinion requires control and consistency. Influencing international audiences requires speed, adaptability, credibility, and a willingness to engage with complex realities in real time. The latter demands a communications culture capable of responding rapidly to events and shaping interpretation before competing narratives take hold. That capability remains limited. As a result, Russia often finds itself reacting to stories rather than defining them. The third factor is perhaps the most politically significant of all. It concerns diplomacy. For a considerable period, Putin appears to have pursued a deliberate strategy aimed at preserving opportunities for engagement with Donald Trump and figures associated with his political movement. Reports from Moscow have frequently suggested that Russian media organizations were encouraged to avoid direct confrontation with Trump, limit criticism of the United States where possible, and maintain an atmosphere conducive to future dialogue. From a diplomatic perspective, the logic is understandable. The Kremlin appears to have viewed a potential political shift in Washington as an opportunity to improve relations, reduce strategic isolation, and possibly create conditions for a negotiated settlement of the conflict. Whether that expectation was realistic is open to debate. What is less debatable is the impact such a strategy can have on public messaging. When a government consistently moderates its responses in order to preserve diplomatic channels, it inevitably affects how those responses are perceived abroad. For example, when drone strikes occur deep inside Russian territory and the public response remains restrained, international observers draw conclusions. Supporters may interpret restraint as maturity. Critics may interpret it as weakness. Potential adversaries may conclude that escalation carries relatively little risk. And in the current European security environment, perception matters enormously. European governments have become increasingly influential in shaping support for Ukraine. Their decisions affect military aid, financial assistance, sanctions enforcement, and broader strategic coordination. If Moscow's measured responses are interpreted as a sign that stronger actions are unlikely, that assessment can encourage greater confidence among those advocating continued escalation. This creates a strategic dilemma. Efforts designed to preserve diplomatic flexibility with one audience may simultaneously undermine deterrence with another. That tension appears increasingly visible within Russia's own political institutions. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has, on several occasions, adopted notably sharper rhetoric than the Kremlin's broader public posture might suggest. His comparisons between current European political dynamics and the atmosphere that existed before the Second World War are particularly striking. Such historical references are not chosen casually. They are intended to communicate urgency. They suggest concern that Europe is moving towards a more confrontational strategic mindset and that the risks of miscalculation are growing. Importantly, those remarks can also be interpreted as reflecting internal debates within the Russian state itself. Different institutions often assess risks differently. The foreign ministry, military leadership, and security establishment may view developments through one lens, while diplomatic strategists focused on long-term engagement with Washington may view them through another. As a result, competing priorities begin to emerge. One side emphasizes deterrence, clarity, and strategic signaling. The other prioritizes flexibility, dialogue, and the preservation of future diplomatic opportunities. The challenge is that these approaches do not always complement one another. At times, they can appear contradictory. This helps explain why Russian messaging has often seemed inconsistent. Strong warnings are issued only to be followed by moderation. Firm language is adopted, then softened. Red lines are articulated, yet enforcement remains unclear. Over time, such inconsistencies weaken strategic credibility. History offers numerous examples of leaders who misinterpreted courtesy as partnership or dialogue as progress. Diplomatic engagement can be valuable, but it is not automatically evidence that meaningful breakthroughs are approaching. Several initiatives intended to improve relations or establish new frameworks for negotiation have generated substantial discussion but limited tangible results. The conflict continues. The core disagreements remain unresolved, and despite repeated efforts to preserve political openings, there has been little evidence of a comprehensive breakthrough capable of transforming the broader strategic landscape. Yet the underlying approach persists. That reality leads to a broader conclusion. In modern politics and international affairs, military success alone is rarely sufficient. Governments must also explain their objectives, justify their actions, and communicate developments in ways that influence public understanding. Power is no longer measured solely by what happens on the battlefield. It is also measured by who controls the narrative surrounding those events. And in that arena, Russia continues to face challenges that military achievements alone cannot solve.